The laboratory at night was a cathedral of silence, its usual daytime hum of centrifuges and murmured conversation replaced by the faint, persistent whisper of climate control. Dr. Elara Vance sat alone at her desk, a pool of warm light from her lamp cutting through the sterile gloom. Before her, glowing on the screen, was her own complete blood count, a constellation of numbers and abbreviations mapping the inner sea of her body. Her eyes skipped past the familiar markers, hemoglobin, platelets, white cells, and settled on the line that had held her attention for the past hour: RAG antigen, negative. It was a simple notation, a clinical fact she had known about herself for decades, yet tonight, in the profound quiet, it felt less like a data point and more like a cipher, a biological whisper from the deep past, a silent signature written in the language of antigens and alleles. Her own blood, the very substance of her life, carried a minor mystery. Roughly 15% of her supposed ancestral population shared this trait, a percentage that dwindled to near insignificance in other parts of the world. Science had explanations, of course, theories of genetic drift, founder effects, and selective pressures so subtle they were nearly ghosts in the machine. But the Asterisk story. Asterisk was missing. The narrative thread. She leaned back, the chair giving a soft sigh. Through the window the city glittered, a testament to millennia of accumulated knowledge and endeavour. Somewhere out there, in the veins of strangers, the same quiet anomaly pulsed. It caused no superhuman abilities, conferred no obvious advantage in the modern world. In fact, it could complicate pregnancy, a paradox that had always fascinated her, a trait that persisted, not through rampant proliferation, but through a tenacious, quiet endurance across epochs. It was a thread woven through the vast tapestry of human migration, surviving ice ages, plagues, and voyages into the unknown, not by shouting its presence but by whispering, generation after generation. Ilara's mind drifted from the clinical present into the shadowy corridors of deep time. She pictured not chromosomes but people, a hunter on a frozen plain, clutching a wound that sealed just a little faster, a mother in a stone hut, surviving a birth that claimed others, a sailor on a wooden ship, his resilience a minor marvel to his companions. These were the silent carriers, the unwitting custodians of this bloodline. They lived, loved, struggled, and died without ever knowing the peculiar signature they carried within them, a signature that had navigated the bottleneck of prehistory and fanned out across continents. Her own journey to this field, to genetics, had been a search for connection, a way to anchor her own sense of self in something more substantial than the fragmented family stories of recent immigrants and vague, romanticized notions of Celtic or Basque heritage. She had sought answers in DNA, and found instead a deeper, more resonant question. The Rh negative factor was not just a personal trait, it was a shared inheritance, a chapter in a story that began long before recorded history. It was a legacy of survival, written not in stone or parchment, but in the very fluid of life, a resolve, quiet but steely, crystallized within her. The published papers, the population genetics models, the dry phylogenetic trees, they were necessary, but insufficient. They mapped the asterisk where asterisk and the asterisk when asterisk, but not the asterisk who asterisk. She wanted to trace the silence, to give shadowy form to the generations of carriers, to imagine the moments, the cuts, the fevers, the childbirths, the accidents, where this hidden thread might have subtly altered the weave of a life, of a lineage. It would be an unconventional project, part science, part historical reconstruction, a pursuit bordering on reverence for the anonymous dead. She saved the file, the screen winking into darkness, leaving only the reflection of her own thoughtful face superimposed on the night city. The anomaly in her blood was no longer just a clinical curiosity, it was an invitation, a summons to follow a trail that had been cooling for 45,000 years. It was a story of human resilience, told not through great battles or grand discoveries, but through the intimate, unrecorded drama of survival and inheritance. The journey would be one of inference and imagination, connecting dots across a map of millennia. Rising, she switched off the desk lamp, plunging her corner of the lab into darkness. The city's ambient light now provided the only illumination, casting long spectral shadows from the spectrometers and sequencing machines. As she gathered her coat, she felt a strange sense of companionship with the past. She was not the beginning of this story, nor would she be its end. She was merely a point of awareness along its endless winding course. Her blood was an archive, and she, its latest reader. The quiet of the lab was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of countless heartbeats, a rhythmic, silent chorus from the deep past, all leading to this moment, to this woman in a modern lab, ready to listen. The work would start not with a test tube, but with a question, and a map of the world, waiting for its silent history to be gently, patiently traced. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 2. The First Carriers. Part 1. Asterisk. The wind was a blade of ice, honed on the glaciers to the north, and wetted on the bare rock of the tundra. It scoured the land, a relentless force that shaped not just the earth, but the very rhythm of life upon it. Under a sky the colour of bruised slate, a small band of figures moved, dark specks against the endless expanse of grey and white. They were Homo sapiens, newcomers to this ancient frozen continent, and every step was a negotiation with a world that granted survival only to the most tenacious. At the front of the group, Anuc moved with a predator's economy. At 16 summers, his lean frame was all sinew and focused intent. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the low scrub and distant stands of stunted pine, reading the landscape for the slightest tremor of life. Over his shoulder, he carried a spear tipped with carefully flaked flint, its shaft worn smooth by his grip. Behind him followed the rest of the clan, a dozen souls wrapped in furs, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Among them was his sister Kira, a year his junior. Where Anuc was all silent vigilance, Kira possessed a watchful curiosity, her gaze often lingering on the patterns of frost on a leaf or the distant flight of a raven. They had been tracking a reindeer herd since dawn, following the faint disturbances in the hoarfrost and the occasional tuft of coarse hair caught on bark. The herd was life itself. Its meat would fill bellies, its hide would provide warmth, its bones and sinew would become tools and thread. The pursuit was a slow, grueling ballet of patience and positioning, driven by a hunger that was as much a part of them as their own breath. As the afternoon light began to fail, leaching what little colour there was from the world, the clan reached the edge of a shallow ravine. Below, a trickle of water, not yet fully frozen, cut through the stone. The reindeer tracks led down and across. Anuc raised a hand, and the group stilled. He pointed with his chin. A solitary young bull, perhaps separated from the main herd, was drinking hesitantly at the stream's edge 50 paces away. Silence descended, deeper than the cold. Anuc's world narrowed to the arc of his throw, the weight of the spear, the rise and fall of the animal's flank. He inhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs, and exhaled a prayer to the spirits of the hunt. Then he moved, not a run, but a fluid, powerful uncoiling of his body. The spear left his hand with a soft, deadly hiss. It was not a perfect strike. The flint point struck high on the bull's shoulder, instead of piercing its heart. The animal bellowed in shock and pain, stumbling sideways before surging up the opposite bank of the ravine. Instinct took over. The clan erupted into motion, a chorus of shouts splitting the air as they scrambled down the rocky slope and gave chase. The wounded reindeer was faster, terror lending its strength, but the trail of crimson splashes on the snow was a promise. The chase led through a thicket of skeletal birch. Anuc, in the lead, ducked under a low branch. Kira, close behind, did not see the jagged, broken stump of another, hidden by a drift. It caught the side of her thigh as she passed, a brutal, tearing impact. She cried out, more in surprise than immediate pain, and fell heavily into the snow. The hunt continued ahead, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. For a moment, there was only the whisper of the wind and Kira's ragged breathing. She pushed herself up, looking down at the damage. The fur leggings were shredded, and beneath, a deep gash welled blood, shockingly vivid against her skin and the white snow. The pain arrived then, a bright hot wave that made her vision swim. She pressed a mittened hand against it, the fur instantly soaking through. It was Tor, the clan's elder and healer, who found her. He had hung back, his old bones less suited to the frantic sprint, his face, a network of wrinkles carved by decades of wind and sun, showed no panic as he knelt beside her. Gently he moved her hand aside and examined the wound. He grunted, a non-committal sound, and reached for his pouch. From it, he took a handful of dried sphagnum moss and a strip of clean leather. He worked quickly, packing the moss against the gash and binding it tight with the leather strip. His fingers, though gnarled, were deft. As he applied pressure, he watched the flow of blood with the practiced eye of one who had seen countless injuries. He expected to see the moss darken steadily, to feel the warmth seep through the bandage, but the seepage slowed with unusual haste. When he carefully lifted the edge of the packing a few minutes later to check, he saw not a fresh welling, but the beginning of a viscous, clotted closure at the edges of the torn flesh. Tor paused, his brows knitting slightly. He had seen wounds clot before, but rarely so swiftly from a cut this deep, especially in the biting cold which usually slowed such processes. It was a small thing, a subtle deviation from the expected rhythm of injury and repair. He made no pronouncement, offered no explanation. Such concepts did not exist for him. He noted it as one notes a cloud that passes without rain, or a berry bush that fruits a week early, a minor anomaly in the great intricate pattern of the world. It was a good sign, that was all. The girl was strong, the spirits of her blood were vigilant. By the time the others returned, triumphant and dragging the slain reindeer, Kira was already standing, leaning on Tor's shoulder. The bandage was secure, and a dull ache had replaced the sharp agony. Anuk rushed to her side, his eyes wide with concern that quickly turned to relief. The success of the hunt and Kira's apparent resilience merged into a single wave of communal fortune. That night, around a fire built in the lee of a great granite boulder, the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the low hum of contentment. The story was told of Anuk's throw and the long chase, of the bull's strength and its eventual fall. Kira's cut was mentioned only in passing, a footnote to the greater tale of provision. She sat close to the flames, the warmth seeping into her bones. The hidden wound beneath its dressing had already begun the silent, efficient work of knitting itself back together, a process governed by an ancient, unremarkable code within her that differed, in one quiet way, from most of her kin. She felt no different. She was simply Kira, who had been cut and was now healing. She ate the rich, fatty meat, listened to the stories and watched the sparks spiral up into the vast, star-strewn darkness. The anomaly in her blood, a quirk of inheritance from ancestors whose names were lost even to memory, had done its minor, vital service. It had tipped the balance, just slightly, toward survival. No one celebrated it. No one even knew it was there. It was simply a part of her, as much as the colour of her eyes, or the shape of her hands, a silent passenger on the long, cold journey through a glacial world. Asterisk. Chapter 2. The First Carriers. Part 2. Asterisk. The winter descended not as a season, but as a siege. It came howling down from the ice-draped peaks, a white fury that buried the familiar landmarks and silenced the world under a suffocating blanket of snow. The clan's usual shelters, overhangs and shallow caves, became wind-scoured traps, the cold gnawing at their warmth with relentless teeth. The reindeer had vanished into the white void, and the stores of dried meat and fat dwindled with terrifying speed. Hunger was a constant hollow companion, and the cough that began in the oldest of them spread like a creeping frost through the group. Anuk, now a man hardened by 2 more cycles of seasons, watched the life ebb from his people with a growing desperation. His father, once a mighty hunter, succumbed to the coughing sickness first, his breath rattling to a stop one still, brutal dawn. Kira, a woman grown, moved through the grief with a quiet fortitude, her focus on the practical, melting snow for water, tending the feeble fire, sharing her own meagre portions with the children. But her own body was changing, rounding with a new life conceived in the last days of autumn. The timing was cruel. It was Tor, his own frame gaunt, but his eyes still sharp, who spoke of the valley, in the fragmented stories of his own youth, told by a grandfather long since ice. There was a place where the mountains curved like a cupped hand, sheltered from the northern winds, fed by a hot spring that kept the ground bare and the air misty. It was said to be a refuge where green things persisted even in the deep cold. A legend, perhaps, but legends were all they had left. The decision to go was not a decision at all. It was the final option. The remaining clan members, 8 souls, including 2 young children and a nursing mother, gathered their pitiful belongings: furs, a few tools, the last strips of leathery meat. They looked to Anuk and Kira, the strongest of them now, to lead. The journey was a slow-motion agony through a world reduced to blinding white and aching blue shadow. They moved by day when the light was less deceptive, following Tor's memory and the vague lay of the land. Anuk broke trail, his legs plunging knee-deep with each step. Kira followed, one hand often pressed to the swell of her belly, her breath coming in short, sharp clouds. After 7 suns of brutal travel, when hope had shriveled to a frozen pebble in each chest, they found the pass. It was a narrow, winding cut between 2 sheer cliffs of black rock, and drifting from it, like a promise on the air, came a faint earthy scent of damp stone and something green. The final descent was a slide and stumble on icy scree, but then the world opened. The valley was a secret held by the mountains. Steaming water pooled in terraces of mineral-stained stone, trickling down in rivulets that defied the frost. Patches of hardy grass and moss clung to the warm earth, and stunted, twisted pines grew thicker here, their boughs laden with snow but their trunks strong. It was not paradise. The cold still bit, and food was scarce, but it was life. The hot spring provided constant water and a place to warm numbed limbs. They scavenged lichen, dug for frozen roots, and Anuk, with incredible luck, managed to spear a mountain hare drawn to the warmth. It was here, in a rough lean-to built against a heat-radiating rock face, that Kira's labour began. The pains came in the dead of night, sharp and regular. The other woman, Una, who had lost her own infant to the cold weeks before, acted as midwife, her hands gentle, but her face etched with worry. Birth was always a threshold, but here, at the edge of the world, it felt like a gamble with the spirits of the ice. The child, a daughter, emerged with a thin, protesting cry that was the sweetest sound any of them had heard in months. Kira, exhausted but radiant, held the tiny, squirming form against her skin, wrapping her in the softest fox fur. They named her Lena, for the faint green shoots they had found by the spring, a token of perseverance. But the valley's sanctuary was not absolute. A fever, swift and vicious, swept through the camp days later. It began with the children, a flush, a glassy-eyed lethargy, then a heat that seemed to burn from within. The clan's youngest boy died first, his small body succumbing in a fit of shivers. Una, already weakened by grief and hunger, followed him into the stillness. Despair, colder than the mountain air, settled over the survivors. Lena, just a handful of days old, grew feverish. Her tiny face flushed, her cries became weak, plaintive mewls. Kira refused to sleep, cradling her daughter day and night, wiping her with cool cloths dipped in the spring, whispering ancient, half-remembered lullabies. She felt a terror so profound it was a physical weight, a certainty that this fragile new life, born into such hardship, would be taken. The fever raged for 3 days. The infant's breath grew rapid and shallow. Yet, on the 4th morning, as a pale sun gilded the valley's mist, the terrible heat began to recede. Lena's skin cooled to a damp normalcy. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear. She nuzzled weakly and took milk. She had passed through the fire. The other surviving child, a girl of 4 summers, also recovered, though she remained listless for many days. The adults, including Anuk and Tor, had experienced only mild, fleeting symptoms. Tor observed it all with his healer's quiet gaze. He saw Kira's relentless vitality through the ordeal, her own strength seemingly undiminished by birth and vigil. He saw the infant's improbable rally. In his mind, he connected these things not to the invisible workings of blood, but to a more comprehensible force, the fierce will of a mother, the toughness of a lineage, the spirit of Kira's blood, he thought, remembering the swift closing wound of years past, was strong. It had guarded the mother, and in doing so, had passed its guardianship to the daughter. It was a blessing, a thread of resilience woven into their family. He mentioned this to Anuk one evening, not as science but as story, a tale of fortitude that would become part of their small oral history. Kira, feeling her daughter's steady heartbeat against her own, knew nothing of genetics or inherited traits. She knew only the crushing relief of love preserved. She attributed Lena's survival to the warmth of the spring, to Tor's muttered charms, to her own stubborn refusal to let go. The biological truth was a silent, microscopic reality, a peculiarity in her blood, a difference in the surface of her cells, and now her daughters had perhaps mounted a more effective, unseen defense against the ravaging fever. It was a quirk of inheritance that had proven its worth not in strength or speed, but in the subtle, vital art of endurance. As Lena slept peacefully in her arms, the trait unseen, unnamed, uncelebrated, settled into a new generation. It was a quiet passenger, now too, destined to travel forward through time, its significance hidden within the simple, profound fact of a child who lived when others did not. The thread, tenuous but unbroken, continued its silent journey. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 3. The Herders of the Steppe. Asterisk. Asterisk. 10,000 years had softened the world. The great ice had retreated, leaving in its wake a vast rolling sea of grass that stretched from horizon to horizon under an immense bowl of sky. This was the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a land of wind and whispering stems, of sudden thunderstorms and relentless sun. Here, a new rhythm had taken hold, one dictated not by the chase but by the herd. Humanity had learned to bend the will of other creatures to its own, and in doing so had unlocked a new kind of journey. Scienta felt this rhythm in her bones. At 15 summers, her life was defined by the slow, grazing migration of sheep. She walked at the periphery of the flock, a long staff in her hand, her eyes constantly moving across the woolly backs. The air hummed with insects and carried the warm, dusty scent of lanolin and dry earth. Her family's clan was small, a few related families moving together with their animals, their worldly possessions piled onto wooden sledges dragged by placid oxen. They were herders, among the first to weave their fate so intimately with that of domesticated beasts. Her world was one of immense space and intimate detail. She knew each ewe by the pattern of its face, the set of its ears. She could read the sky for coming rain, and the grass for its sweetness. At night, they camped by one of the shallow meandering rivers that scarred the plain, the tents of felt and hide glowing from within like giant lanterns against the deepening violet dusk. The stories told then were not of great hunts but of lost lambs found, of strange pastures, of the slow westward drift that had become the background of their existence. Whispers spoke of other lands beyond the great river, of forests and different peoples. Movement was in their blood, as much as the blood of their sheep. Sana was promised to a boy from a neighbouring family, a union meant to strengthen herds and alliances. Her marriage was not a grand ceremony, but a practical folding of one life into another. Her new husband, Kale, was quiet and strong, his hands calloused from rope and hide. Their tent was pitched next to his parents', and their shared portion of the flock was marked by a notch in the sheep's ears that Sana herself had carved. Life continued its seasonal round, the move to summer pastures, the breeding, the shearing, the careful navigation toward winter grazing grounds. When she felt the first stirrings of new life within her the following spring, it was met with quiet joy and pragmatic preparation. Childbirth on the steppe was a common, dangerous passage. The women of the clan gathered knowledge like herbs, techniques for easing pain, herbs to encourage milk, prayers to the spirits of motherhood and earth. Sana's own mother, Alaya, assured her that the lineage of their family was strong. Women bore children and worked the next day. But the birth, when it came with the autumn rains, defied such easy assurances. The labour was long and grinding, stretching through a day and into a second night. The pains were a tempest that left her trembling and spent in the intervals. Inside the close, smoky warmth of the tent, the experienced midwives worked, their faces growing increasingly grim as the hours piled up. The baby, a boy, was positioned awkwardly, finally, with a last, tearing effort that felt like her very core was being sundered. He emerged into the world, limp and silent for a heart-stopping moment, before a thin, reedy cry filled the air. The relief was immediate but short-lived. As the midwives cleaned and swaddled the infant, a different, more insidious crisis unfolded. The flood of lifeblood that should have slowed continued, a warm, relentless seep that darkened the hides beneath Sana. The midwives exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They applied pressure, used the astringent herbs, recited the strongest prayers, yet the flow continued, a quiet red tide that seemed to carry her very vitality away with it. Scientists' awareness began to recede, the voices around her growing distant, the light of the oil lamp swimming and fracturing. She felt cold, a deep cold that started in her extremities and crept inward, despite the sweat on her brow and the stifling heat of the tent. This was the shadow that fell across so many birthing beds, the hemorrhage that wrote finis to countless stories. Alea clutched her daughter's hand, her face a mask of helpless dread. Cale stood frozen at the tent flap, the joy of fatherhood curdling into ash in his mouth. The midwives' efforts became frantic, then resigned. They had seen this path before. It led only one way, but Sana's body, in its deepest, most ancient programming, was engaged in a different silent calculus. The intricate cascade of clotting factors, the platelets swarming to the site of injury, the vessel walls constricting in her. This process operated with a subtle, crucial difference. The absence of a specific antigen on the surface of her red cells was irrelevant. What mattered was the resultant unseen efficiency of her coagulation, a legacy passed down through millennia from ancestors who had survived gashes on icy tundra and fevers in sheltered valleys. As her conscious mind grayed out, this hidden biology worked with relentless microscopic urgency. The flow did not stop with a dramatic halt, but with a gradual, stubborn tapering. The midwife, pressing the bundled moss against her, felt the warm seep become a slow ooze, then a sticky trickle. An hour passed, an eternity in the dim tent. Sana's breathing, which had grown shallow and rapid, deepened slightly, the deathly pallor on her lips lessened by the faintest degree. When the senior midwife checked again at dawn, her fingers came away stained but not wet. The hemorrhage had ceased. Her recovery was slow, a fragile boat navigating treacherous waters. For days she hovered in a twilight of exhaustion, nourished by broths and her mother's constant care. The infant, named Tarek, thrived at her side, his hungry mouth drawing forth a milk supply that seemed a miracle in itself. The clan spoke of it in hushed tones around the evening fires. Sana's survival was attributed to the potency of the midwives' herbs, to the favor of the Earth Mother spirit, to the legendary toughness of her maternal line. It was a story of spirit and luck, for they had no other language for it. By the time the first snow dusted the steppe, Sana was walking again, though a lingering weakness trailed her like a shadow. She carried Tarek in a sling against her chest. As she resumed her slow circuits around the grazing sheep, the vast sky seemed even more immense now, a reminder of her own smallness and her improbable persistence. The hidden thread within her, the quiet anomaly in her blood, had written its signature on the moment of her greatest vulnerability. It had not made her invincible, but it had tipped the balance, just enough toward life. And life on the steppe was movement. The following spring, the talk turned again to the west. Grass had been overgrazed here. Stories from scouts told of lush, untouched valleys beyond the next great river. The decision was made. The felt tents were struck, the sledges repacked, the herds gathered into a bleating, dusty river of life. Sana lifted Tarek onto her hip, her body now strong once more. She took her place in the long, slow column of people and animals, a line etched against the endless green. With each step westward, the thread within her travelled. It was carried in her veins, and in the veins of her son, who would one day father children of his own near the banks of a foreign river. The trait was not a conqueror's banner, it was a survivor's quiet breath. It spread not through invasion, but through the simple, relentless logic of migration. A family seeking pasture, a people in motion, carrying within them an ancient silent inheritance that had once again proven its worth in a moment of silent crisis. The steppe wind blew at their backs, urging them onward, scattering the seeds of grass and the hidden lines of blood across the face of the changing world. 5,000 years had woven a new tapestry upon the land. The great ice was a distant memory, a tale told by elders to explain the shape of valleys and the scatter of boulders. In its place, A green and wooded Britain had risen, its oak forests deep and whispering, its chalk downs rolling under vast, changeable skies. Here, humanity had put down roots that delved deep into the earth, and from that connection they sought to build a dialogue with the heavens themselves. Bren, a boy of 10 summers with eyes the colour of a rain-swelled stream, stood on the grassy lip of the great chalk excavation, his heart drumming against his ribs. Below him, in a vast, meticulously scraped basin, hundreds of his people moved with a purpose that felt older than words. They were building something that would outlast the oldest oak, something for the gods and the ancestors and the children not yet born. They were raising the stones. The air thrummed with effort. Teams of men, their backs gleaming with sweat and chalk dust, strained against ropes woven from lime bark. Before them, a sarsen stone, a grey giant dragged from the downs 20 miles distant, lay prone on a wooden sled. The sled itself rested on a track of greased logs. With a rhythmic grunting chant, the men heaved. The sled groaned forward an inch, then another, inching the 30-ton monolith toward its destined socket in the vast, incomplete circle. The sound was a symphony of creaking wood, grinding stone, and human breath pushed to its limit. Bren's mother, Elara, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She was not old in years, but in wisdom, and thus was revered. Her hair, streaked with early grey, was braided with charms of bone and amber. She watched the labour, not with the boy's wide-eyed excitement, but with a deep, solemn satisfaction. "See how it turns. The circle," she said, her voice low and melodic, carrying over the din. "It is a wheel of the world. The sun enters here at the high summer, and there at the deep winter. The dead walk its path, and we," she squeezed his shoulder, "we are its keepers. Our blood has been here since the first fires were lit on these hills. We have the old blood, Bren. It remembers." Bren did not fully understand, but he felt the weight of the words. The old blood was a phrase she used often. It did not mean they were chiefs or warriors. They were diggers, rope makers, herders of the pigs that fed the work crews. It meant endurance. It meant surviving the hard winters when the frost bit deep, the wet summers when the grain mouldered. It meant his grandmother had lived to see 50 seasons, a rare feat. It was a quiet pride, a sense of being anchored in this specific patch of earth by something more than memory. For days, Bren carried water skins to the workers, his small legs pumping up and down the chalky slopes. He watched as the great uprights were levered into their pits, the air thick with the smell of crushed grass and damp earth. At night, by the fire in their roundhouse, a snug dwelling of wattle, daub, and thatch, his mother would tell stories, not of the stones, but of the people. She spoke of a grandmother who had survived a fall from a cliff, of a great-uncle who had walked for 10 days with a poisoned thorn in his foot to bring warning of a raiding party. "The old blood is strong," she would murmur, stroking Bren's hair. "It does not shout, it persists." Then, with the cruel swiftness of a hawk's strike, the coughing sickness came. It began in the eastern settlement, where traders from across the water had come with shells and rare flint. A fever, then a racking cough that tore the breath from the body, leaving victims gasping like fish on a bank. It swept through the dense worker camps, an invisible choking fog. The great work on the stones slowed, then halted. The chant of heaving men was replaced by the sound of coughing from 100 huts, and the mournful wails for the dead. Bren's family retreated to their isolated steading on the western edge of the downs, a day's walk from the main site, but sickness had no respect for distance. First his cousin who shared their roof fell ill, then the old shepherd who lived with them. The roundhouse, once filled with the smells of stew and wood smoke, now reeked of sweat and fear and the bitter herbs Elara burned in a desperate attempt to cleanse the air. Bren watched, terrified, as his cousin's skin grew waxy, his coughs becoming weak, wet rattles. Elara tended to him tirelessly, her face a mask of calm that did not reach her eyes. She made Bren drink a bitter tea 3 times a day, made from plants she gathered at the new moon. She anointed his forehead with ash, and muttered the old words. He felt fine, just a scratchy throat one morning, that was gone by noon. His mother fell into a deep, exhausted sleep for a full day and night, but woke clear-eyed, her strength returning while others faded. One by one, the sick in their household passed through the crisis. His cousin, after a week that teetered on the edge of the abyss, sat up and asked for broth. The old shepherd, though weakened, survived. Their family unit, though scarred by fear, remained intact. All around them, from the other steadings and the great camp, came the news carried by fleeing, healthy survivors. Whole families had been erased. The great ditch by the stones was said to be filling with bodies. The world had narrowed to the fight for breath. When the sickness had passed, leaving a bruised and grieving land, Bren walked with his mother to the high place overlooking their valley. The air was crisp and clean, scoured by the tragedy. Below, smoke rose from only half the hearths that had once dotted the landscape. Ilara placed a hand on his head. "The old blood has shielded us," she said, her voice thick with a grief for her people, but also with a fierce, undeniable gratitude. "The ancestors have turned their faces away from the sickness for us. It is a blessing, a heavy blessing. We are here to continue, to remember them, to finish the circle." Bren looked up at her, then out at the quiet, wounded land. He did not feel blessed. He felt confused and sad and guilty for his own health. He did not know that within him, and within his mother, coursed a biological legacy that had, over millennia, developed a subtly different relationship with certain pathogens, a legacy of genetic isolation that had pooled in these island populations. He did not know that the old blood was not just a story, but a quiet, cellular truth. The plague, which had acted like a wildfire through the more genetically homogeneous main camp, had encountered in his family a slightly different, more resistant terrain. It was not immunity, but a marginal, crucial advantage, a whisper of distinction in their veins. They returned to the stone circle weeks later. The workforce was diminished, the songs quieter, but the resolve had hardened, the living built now for the dead as much as for the sky. Bren, carrying his water skins, saw the great lintels being raised, locked into place with perfect timeless joints. As he watched a stone settle into its home with a final grinding sigh, he thought of his mother's words: persistence, endurance. The circle was not just a calendar of sun and moon, it was a testament to the will to continue, to build meaning against the void of loss. His family had survived. They were here, and as he placed his small hand against the cool, rough surface of the newly erected sarsen, he felt a connection, not just to the stone and the people around him, but to a line that stretched back into a deep, shadowy past. It was a line that had weathered ice and fever, and now plague, a thread of quiet resilience woven into the very fabric of his being. The old blood, silent and steadfast, had carried them through, and as the sun broke through the clouds, casting the great circle into sharp relief against the green downland, Bren understood, in a way beyond words, that he was a part of something vast and enduring, a story written not on parchment but in stone and in bone. The Asterisk. Chapter 5. The Isolated Valley. Part 1. Asterisk. 3,000 years ago, the High Pyrenees were not a border, but a world entire. Glaciers had retreated, leaving behind a cathedral of stone, jagged peaks that pierced a sky of impossible blue, valleys so deep they drowned in perpetual shadow, and alpine meadows that blazed with wild flowers for a few brief, glorious weeks each summer. In one such hanging valley, cradled like a secret in the palm of the mountains, a small community lived as if the rest of humanity had ceased to exist. The only paths in were treacherous goat tracks, and the only sounds were the wind's mournful song through the passes, the clatter of rockfalls, and the distant eternal rush of meltwater. Here, time moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of seasons, not empires. The people of the valley were a closed circle, their faces etched by high-altitude sun and wind into a familial pattern of strong bones and watchful eyes. They spoke a tongue that had grown thick and peculiar in its isolation, full of words for types of snow and the moods of goats that would be nonsense to lowlanders. Their world was vertical and intimate. They knew each ledge where the ibex bred, each south-facing slope where barley could be coaxed to ripeness, each hidden spring that never froze. Their stories told around hearths of smoky peat, or of the valley itself and of the ancestors who had first found this refuge. The elders spoke of those forebears as people who had come from beyond the northern ice, fleeing a great cold or a great war, their origin now blurred into myth. They were simply the first ones, and their blood, it was said, ran true and strong in the valley's children. Among these children was Livia. At 17, she was both of the valley and strangely distinct from it. Her hair was not the common deep brown, but the colour of winter flax, a pale gold that seemed to hold the weak sunlight even on cloudy days. Her skin, too, refused to take the same leathery bronze hue as her kin. It remained fair, freckling and burning where others simply darkened, a source of gentle teasing and occasional concern. But it was her connection to the green world that truly set her apart. While other girls gathered herbs with practical knowledge, Livia approached the plants with a kind of silent communion. She could not explain it, but certain leaves made her fingertips tingle. The scent of crushed wolfsbane brought a metallic taste to her tongue and a swift dizzying headache. A tea of common yarrow, a remedy for fevers, would sometimes send her pulse skittering where it calmed others. The old healer, a woman named Amaya with eyes like river stones, watched her closely, calling it a sensitivity, a gift and a burden from the old blood. She taught Livia to listen to her own body as another might listen to the weather, to avoid what caused disquiet, to use only the plants that sang to her in quiet harmony. Livia accepted this peculiarity as her lot. Her life was one of prescribed rhythms, tending the family's goats on the steep pastures, carding wool by the fire, grinding barley in the stone quern. She expected to marry one of the valley boys, perhaps sturdy, silent Ibon, who could read the clouds, and raise children who would know no horizon but the ring of mountains. The thought was not unpleasant. It was a known path, worn smooth by generations. The mountains were both prison and protector, and she had learned to love their stern embrace. This insulated reality shattered the summer. The trader came. His arrival was an event of seismic rarity. First the dogs set up a frantic, unfamiliar barking, then a shout echoed from the watch point on the eastern pass. By the time the stranger was led down into the village clearing by two wary hunters, the entire community had gathered, their curiosity a palpable force. He was a man of perhaps 25, lean and weathered, but his eyes held a restless light never seen in the valley. His clothes were of a strange cut, woven from a finer wool, and he carried a pack that smelled of distant places, salt, pine resin, and lowland smoke. He was Basque, from the northern foothills where the mountains gentled into rolling hills that eventually met the sea. He dealt in what the valley lacked: salt blocks, sharp metal needles, tiny beads of coloured glass, and news. His name was Aniko. He spoke a version of their tongue, enough to barter. For a week he became the centre of the valley's universe. He displayed his wares on a blanket, his hands moving with a storyteller's grace. He spoke of vast forests where trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun, of rivers wider than their whole valley, of stone settlements where hundreds lived stacked upon one another, and of the great grey sea that stretched to the edge of the world, its water bitter and endless. Livia listened, rapt, from the edges of the crowd. His words painted pictures in her mind that her imagination, bounded by peaks, had never conceived. She watched the way his hands shaped the air, the easy smile that played on his lips, the way he looked at the mountains not as walls, but as landmarks on a larger map. She was fetching water from the spring when he approached her alone. He had asked for directions to a particular herb Amaya used, and somehow Livia was the one sent to show him. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps on the scree and the distant bleat of goats. Then he spoke, not of trade, but of the valley. He called it beautiful, but the word held a note of pity, as if beauty in such confinement was a sad thing. He asked her if she ever wondered what lay beyond the next ridge, and the next. Something unlocked in Livia's chest, a door she never knew was closed. She found herself speaking, haltingly at first, then with a rushing clarity, of the feeling of the wind from the east, which carried strange scents, and of her dreams, which sometimes featured vast flat expanses of light. She spoke of the plants that spoke to her skin, a thing she had never confessed to anyone but Amaya. He listened, not as a curiosity, but as if her inner landscape was as fascinating as any he had travelled. He did not call it a gift from the old blood. He simply called it her asterisk. In the days that followed, stolen moments became a secret current running beneath the valley's daily life. A meeting by the waterfall where the rainbows danced in the mist, a shared glance across the fire during the evening gathering, the touch of his hand when he gave her a single blue glass bead, cool and perfect against her palm. He spoke of his home, a place of rolling green and wide skies, where the air was soft and thick. He asked her to see it. The idea was so colossal, so terrifying, it felt less like a decision and more like a tectonic shift within her soul. To leave was to break the circle, to spit upon the graves of the first ones, to abandon the old blood. It was unthinkable, yet she thought of it constantly. The known path with Ibon now felt like a slow burial in a beautiful grave. Eneko's world was vast, unknown and frightening, but it was a world where she might not be an anomaly, but simply a girl from the mountains. The pale skin that marked her here might be unremarkable there. The sensitivity that isolated her might fade in a different air. He saw not the valley's odd daughter, but Livia. On the morning he was to leave, with his pack reloaded with valley wool and medicinal herbs, the community gathered to see him off. The farewells were polite, distant. Livia stood with her family, her heart a wild, trapped bird beating against her ribs. As he turned to start the climb up the pass, he looked back once, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. It was not a pleading look, but an open one, an invitation to a story yet unwritten. The elders said the old blood was strong because it stayed pure, because it remembered. But as she watched Eneko's figure grow smaller against the immense grey rock, Livia felt a different, more terrifying strength awaken within her, the strength to forget, to unremember the walls, to follow a thread of feeling out of the cradle of the mountains. The blood in her veins, with its quiet, ancient history of survival, had persisted through ice and famine by adapting, by moving. Perhaps now, its next adaptation was not of the body, but of the heart, to carry its silent signature beyond the sanctuary, into the great wide mixing world. She did not move that day, but the seed was planted, and in the fertile soil of her longing, it took root. The isolated valley would soon be a memory, and the pale girl with the sensitive skin would become a vessel, carrying the whisper of the northern ice and the high air on a journey down to the sea, where the story of her blood would begin its most profound and perilous dispersal. Asterisk. Chapter 5. The Isolated Valley. Part 2. Asterisk. The decision, when it finally came, was not a declaration but a silent slipping away. In the deep indigo hour before dawn, when the valley was a bowl of shadows, and the only eyes open were those of the hunting owl, Livia rose from her pallet. She dressed in her warmest woolens, fastened the blue glass bead on a thong around her neck, and took the small bundle she had hidden under a loose floor stone, a spare tunic, a wedge of hard cheese, a sliver of soapstone carved like a mountain peak by her grandfather. She paused at the doorway of the roundhouse, listening to the soft familiar snores of her family. Her mother's face in the gloom was a landscape of love and worry, even in sleep. A wave of nausea, part fear, part the early stirrings of the new life within her, rose in her throat. She swallowed it down, stepped over the threshold, and did not look back. Eneko was waiting where the goat track began, its steep ascent toward the eastern pass, a darker shadow against the rock. He said nothing, only took her bundle and secured it to his own pack. His hand found hers, its warmth a shocking anchor in the cold, tremulous dark. Together, they began to climb, leaving the sleeping valley behind. With each step upward, Livia felt a piece of her old self slough away, like a skin she had outgrown. The air grew thinner, the stars brighter, and when the first grey light of dawn revealed the world below, she stopped, turning for one final look. Her home was a smudge of green, in a vast crumpled sea of stone, smoke from the morning hearths beginning to rise in fragile grey threads. It looked impossibly small, and already like a story told about someone else. She touched her belly, where the secret life conceived in a hidden grove the week before Eneko's departure was announced, was quietly knitting itself together. Then she turned her face to the path ahead, to the unknown descent. The journey was a baptism of hardship. The mountains, which had been her protectors, now revealed themselves as indifferent, monumental barriers. The trails were treacherous, often just scree-covered ledges where a misstep meant a plunge into echoing emptiness. They forded icy torrents that numbed her legs to the bone, the water roaring with a voice that drowned all thought. They slept in shallow caves, huddled together for warmth, the wind a constant, keening lament. Eneko was a capable guide, but the way was slow, and Livia's body, adjusting to pregnancy in these brutal conditions, was a new country of fatigue and queasiness. Her fair skin blistered under the alpine sun, then chapped raw in the biting wind. The sensitivity that had been a curiosity in the valley became a torment. Unfamiliar pollens in the lower forests made her eyes swell and her breath catch. She moved through a haze of discomfort, sustained only by Eneko's steady presence and the stubborn, flickering flame of her own choice. After weeks of descent, the world began to change. The jagged peaks softened into rounded, forested hills. The air grew thicker, warmer, carrying the damp, fertile scent of loam and deciduous leaves. They encountered other people, herders with different accents, farmers in small clearings, who viewed the pale, weary girl from the high places with mild curiosity. Finally, they reached Eneko's home, a settlement of stone and timber houses nestled in a green, rolling valley, where a wide, lazy river wound its way toward a horizon that was not a mountain wall, but a gentle, hazy line. To Livia, it felt overwhelmingly open, the sky a vast, pressing dome. The sounds were different, the lowing of cattle, the distant clang of a smithy, the constant murmur of the river. She was a stranger, an object of whispered speculation. Eneko's family, practical farming folk, accepted her with a reserved kindness, attributing her odd pallor and quiet ways to her mountain origins. The pregnancy progressed through a gentle autumn and a mild, wet winter. Livia's body acclimated slowly. The plant sensitivities faded in this new biome, or perhaps she was too preoccupied to notice. She learned the rhythms of the lowland farm, the patterns of the seasons here, so different from the abrupt shifts of the high Pyrenees. She learned snippets of a new tongue, but a part of her remained suspended, a creature of thin air and vertical spaces living in a horizontal world. Her thoughts often travelled back on the wind, up the invisible path to the hidden valley, a place now more dream than memory. When her labour began on a night in early spring, it was with a sudden, intense violence that mirrored her journey. The pains came not as waves, but as convulsions, seizing her body with a force that left her gasping. Eneko's mother, a capable woman named Alasne, who had birthed 6 children of her own, acted as midwife, her face soon etched with concern. The baby, a girl, was stubbornly positioned, and the labour stretched on for a day and a night, depleting Livia's reserves. In the dim, firelit room, the air grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Livia drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind floating back to the high passes, to the sound of the wind, to Amaya's voice murmuring about the old blood. After an eternity, the child was born, a tiny silent thing with a fuzz of pale hair. Alasne worked swiftly, clearing the mouth, rubbing the small back, until a thin, reedy cry pierced the tension. But the relief was again short-lived. As the afterbirth was delivered, a rush of blood followed, more copious than Alasne had ever seen in a living woman. It was a bright arterial flood that soaked the bedding and pooled on the packed earth floor. Alazane pressed down on Livia's abdomen with all her strength, her hands quickly slick and red. She called for boiled cloths, for the herbal styptic she kept for deep cuts, her voice rising in panic. Livia felt herself dissolving, the room darkening at the edges, the sounds becoming muffled as if she were sinking into deep water. This was the end, then, not on a mountain path, but in a strange bed, far from home. Yet, as her consciousness ebbed, the ancient silent machinery within her engaged. The peculiar architecture of her blood, the legacy of countless survivors of gashes, fevers and plagues, enacted its quiet protocol. The clotting cascade, subtly more efficient, more rapid, initiated its life-saving work at the cellular level. The torrent did not cease abruptly, but its fierce urgency began to falter. The relentless flow became a steady seep, then a sluggish ooze. Alasne, applying pressure with trembling arms, felt the change. An hour later, When she dared to lift the sodden compresses, she found not fresh blood, but a dark, clotted mass. The hemorrhage had stopped. Livia's return from the brink was slow. For days she lay in a profound weakness, nourished by spoonfuls of broth, her world reduced to the square of light from the window and the weight of her daughter sleeping against her side. Alazane, tending to her, shook her head in quiet wonder. She had been certain she was witnessing a death. She attributed the miracle to Livia's youth, to an incredible, innate toughness she had seen in mountain folk before. The spirit in her is strong, Alazane told her son and the neighbours. Strong as the rock she came from. It would not let her go. It was a satisfying explanation, rooted in character and origin, not in unseen physiology. To take on water and copper, they hugged the coast of North Africa, trading for ivory and ostrich feathers at dusty outposts. They braved the open sea to reach Malta, where they bartered for honey and wool. At every stop, Damas went ashore. In the crowded markets of Carthage, he haggled over amphorae of olive oil. On the rocky shore of Sardinia, he inspected rough lumps of silver ore. In a sheltered bay on the Iberian coast, he shared a meal with local chieftains, communicating through gesture and a few shared words, exchanging glass for tin. He took lovers in port cities, brief, fragrant encounters that left no lasting mark beyond a fleeting memory. He was a creature of movement and exchange, and in his wake he left more than just traded goods. He left coins, ideas, and the microscopic unwitting legacy of his own lineage. For in Damas, as in his son Hanno, pulsed that quiet, ancient anomaly. It had travelled down from the high steppe, through the mingling populations of the Levant, and into his veins. It conferred no advantage on a merchant sailor. It did not make him a better trader or a stronger rower, but it was there, a silent passenger on his journeys. When a fraying rope snapped and lashed his arm open to the bone during a gale off Crete, the ship's surgeon, a dour Cypriot, expected a long, dangerous recovery. Yet the wound, though fearsome, closed cleanly and with surprising speed, a fact the surgeon noted with grudging admiration, attributing it to Damas's clean living and the dry sea air. The dolphin turned for home as the autumn storms began to gather. The hold was heavy with Iberian silver, Sicilian sulphur, and sacks of rare, fragrant resin from the Atlas Mountains. The return voyage was a race against the weather. One evening, as they skirted the southern coast of Greece, Damas stood at the prow. The water was a sheet of molten lead under a twilight sky. He thought of Tyre, of the citadel glowing in the sunset, of the specific smell of the dye vats. He thought of Alyssa's last letter, still sealed in his chest below, and the mention of his son's early sickness and recovery. A strange, profound sense of continuity settled upon him. He was a link in a chain. His father had been a sailor, and his son would be one. God's willing. They were people of the sea, their lives defined by horizons and homecomings. He could not know that the biological thread he carried was also a voyager, and that his journeys were aiding its quiet global dispersal. In every port, in every transaction, there was a chance, however faint, for that thread to jump the gap. A cut during a dockside brawl that healed a little too well, noticed by a local woman who later bore his child. A knight with a temple priestess in Sicily, who might conceive a daughter with the same resilient blood. Even if he left no direct descendants abroad, his very presence, along with thousands of other Phoenician, Greek, and later Roman traders, created a genetic stir, a mixing of populations that had been separate for millennia. The rare blood factor, concentrated in certain Levantine and Anatolian populations, was now being sprinkled, like rare spice, along the trade routes of the ancient world. The dolphin sailed into Tyre's fortified harbour on a calm morning. The city rose from the sea, magnificent and familiar, its walls gleaming. Damas felt the solid dock under his feet. With a surge of homecoming joy, Alyssa was waiting, Hanno in her arms. The boy was 8 months old, with dark, serious eyes and a strong grip that closed around Damas's finger. Damas saw no trace of the jaundice, only health and vitality. He lifted his son high, the child laughing at the sudden flight, and in that moment, the sea voyage, the storms, the bartering, all condensed into this single point of return and continuity. That night, in their house above the harbour, Damas read Alyssa's old letter by lamplight. He learned of the fear, of the other infants lost, of Hanno's resilience. He looked at his sleeping son, then at his wife. He spoke of the surgeon's comment about his own swift healing, a trivial story. Alyssa nodded, connecting nothing, seeing only the favour of the gods on her household. The two survivals, father's wound, son's infancy, were separate miracles in their minds, unrelated dots in the tapestry of their lives. Yet, in the silent language of biology, they were connected by a single whispering thread. Damas, the seafarer, had spent his life traversing the great connector of civilizations, and within him he carried an inheritance that was itself embarking on its own longest voyage. It would not conquer, it would not dominate, it would simply persist, catching rides on the ships of history, moving from the ancient Levant to the far shores of the Mediterranean, and eventually, through countless other journeys and blendings, to places the Phoenicians never dreamed of. The sea, which had carried Damas, was now carrying his legacy, not in his cargo hold, but in the very essence of his lineage, a silent, enduring passenger on the eternal tides of human movement. Asterisk. Chapter 7. The Scholar of Cordoba. The library of the Caliph of Cordoba was a universe contained within honey-coloured stone. Sunlight, filtered through intricate lattices of wood, fell in geometric patterns upon carpets from Samarkand, and cushions stuffed with lavender. The air itself seemed thick with knowledge, carrying the dry, sweet scent of aging parchment, the tang of iron gall ink, and the faint floral trace of rosewater used to steady the hand. In this quiet heart of 10th century Al-Andalus, where the wisdom of Greeks, Persians, and Indians mingled with the revelations of the Quran, a man could spend a lifetime tracing the contours of God's creation through the meticulous study of his works. Hakim ibn Yusuf was such a man. A physician in the service of the court, his true vocation was not merely healing but observation. While other doctors relied on the aphorisms of Galen or the dictates of Avicenna, Hakim believed the body itself was the most profound text, its symptoms a script to be deciphered with patience and humility. His clinic in the bustling Medina treated everyone from water carriers to viziers, and for each he kept detailed notes in a precise small hand, writing in Arabic on sheets of durable linen paper. These notes were his life's work, a growing atlas of human ailment and recovery. His world was one of balanced humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and the cosmic influences of planets and stars. He understood fevers as an excess of heat, melancholia as a surfeit of black bile. The concept of cells, of genes, of inherited proteins, lay a millennium in the future. Yet within the framework of his time, Hakim possessed a mind that sought patterns with the diligence of an astronomer charting the stars. He noticed, for instance, that certain families were more prone to rheumatic pains in damp weather, or that others seemed to possess a peculiar susceptibility to nosebleeds. These were familial tendencies, he reasoned, a matter of shared complexion and humoral disposition passed from parent to child. It was in the context of childbirth, that perilous and commonplace frontier, that he observed his most curious pattern. Among his many patients were the women of the Al-Zahra family, descendants of a Berber chieftain who had settled in Cordoba generations before. They were not nobility, but prosperous artisans, weavers known for the toughness of their fabrics. Over 20 years, Hakim had attended the births of the grandmother, her 3 daughters, and now 2 of her granddaughters. He had prescribed his usual regimen for pregnancy, moderate exercise, a diet leaning toward the cool and moist, and prayers for an easy delivery. He had administered remedies for morning sickness and salves for stretched skin. The pattern was not in the labours themselves, which varied in duration and pain like any other. It was in the aftermath. The moment after the child was born and the afterbirth delivered was a time of acute danger, when the great vessel that had nourished the infant could become a font of life itself draining away. Hakim had witnessed this tragedy many times. He had his methods: cold compresses, powdered ergot to contract the womb, firm manual pressure, and fervent prayers. Sometimes they worked, often they did not. But with the Al-Zahra women, something was different. In his notes he wrote of the grandmother, Fatima. Postpartum flux notably moderate. Strength returned with the swiftness of a young gazelle. For her daughter, Layla, though the infant was large and the labour protracted, the bleeding ceased with admirable promptness. The patient required less tincture of ergot than is customary. For the granddaughter, Zara, just 2 months prior, a first birth, often treacherous. Yet the hemorrhage was slight, like a spring that dries up after a brief rain. Her colour returned before the dawn prayer. Individually, these were fortunate outcomes, blessings from God. Collectively, across 3 generations, they formed a statistical anomaly that pricked at Hakim's scholarly mind. He reviewed his records for other families, tracing lineages where he had attended multiple births. None showed this consistent moderation of postpartum bleeding. Some families had higher rates of infant survival. Others seemed prone to birthing twins. But the Al-Zahra women's resilience was specific and striking. One afternoon, after treating a spice merchant for gout, Hakim retreated to his study in the library's medical wing. He unrolled his scrolls for the Al-Zahra family. The entries spanning decades, the late sun illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. He dipped his reed pen and began a new commentary, not on a treatment, but on an observation. In the matter of the lineage known as Al-Zahra, he wrote, there appears a curious and consistent fortitude pertaining to the trials of childbirth. The women, while not immune to the pains and perils of that great endeavour, exhibit a remarkable conservation of vital spirit in its concluding act. The loss of blood, that precious humour which carries the vital warmth, is consistently less than one would expect given the circumstances. This is not a matter of robust physique alone, for I have seen robust women succumb to the postpartum flux. It seems rather a quality inherent to their familial constitution. He paused, considering the humoral theory. Could it be that their blood was inherently thicker, more viscous, less prone to wasteful flow, or was their uterine tissue somehow more retentive, contracting with greater force? He had no means to investigate such things. Dissection of the human body was forbidden, and the microscope was an instrument of the distant future. His inquiry reached the limit of his age's science. I term this phenomenon familial fortitude, he continued, a strength of the vital bonds that seems to be passed from mother to daughter. It is as if the clay from which they are formed is of a slightly different temper, holding its shape better under the fire of childbirth. Whether this is influenced by the alignment of planets at their births, or a particular balance of humours established in their lineage, only God the all-knowing can say. Yet the pattern is precise, and worthy of note for the physician, who may take some comfort when attending these women, knowing their nature leans toward preservation. He sanded the ink and rolled the scroll, tying it with a leather cord. The mystery would remain just that, a noted curiosity in a vast sea of medical observations. He would never know that the slightly different temper of their clay was in fact a literal difference on the surface of their red blood cells, a lack of a specific antigen that indirectly influenced the complex cascade of coagulation. The familial fortitude was a genetic whisper, passed down through a lineage that had likely carried it from the steppes, through the Mediterranean world, into the Berber tribes of North Africa, and finally to this sun-drenched city in Iberia. Later, walking through the court of oranges in the fading light, the scent of citrus blossoms heavy in the air, Hakim pondered the limits of his craft. He knew the names of every bone from the asterisk Tashri, asterisk of Ibn Sina, could compound 100 different remedies, and could debate the philosophical nature of the soul. Yet the body held secrets written in a script finer than the most miniature calligraphy. He felt no frustration, only a profound humility. To observe and record was a form of prayer, an acknowledgement of the Creator's infinite complexity. The Al-Zahra thread, documented with such care, would sleep in the archives. Centuries later, wars and reconquests would scatter the libraries of Al-Andalus. Hakim's scroll might be lost to fire or damp, or it might survive, copied and translated, its specific note on a Berber family's childbirth resilience fading into the background noise of historical medical texts. The pattern itself, however, the silent biological truth, would not fade. It would continue down the Al-Zahra line, and through marriages, into other families in Cordoba and beyond. It would survive the fall of the caliphate, the rise of new kingdoms, the ebb and flow of populations. Hakim returned to his home as the muezzin's call echoed from the minaret, a sound that woven through the daily lives of Muslim, Christian and Jew in this city of learning. He had identified a single shimmering thread in the vast tapestry of human heredity. He had given it a name born of his time and understanding: familial fortitude. It was a beautiful, insufficient phrase that captured the effect but utterly missed the cause. Yet in his meticulous notation, in his willingness to see a pattern where others saw only isolated acts of grace, he had for a moment brushed his finger against the hidden weave of history. He had documented a quiet, enduring truth that flowed in the veins of a family of weavers, a truth as strong and subtle as the finest silk, and just as enduring. Asterisk. Chapter 8. The Basque Whaler. The sea off the Newfoundland coast was a different kind of wilderness, a heaving grey-green expanse, where the horizon was a ragged seam between water and low, scudding cloud. It was a world of salt rime, groaning timber, and the vast, mournful silence that fell between the shouts of men. The Amalur a stout Basque whaling ship, rode the swells like a weary labourer, her decks stained with blood and oil, her rigging stiff with cold. For Amanol, at 35, this was his 12th season in the Terra Nova fisheries, a yearly pilgrimage from the sheltered ports of the Bay of Biscay to this raw, abundant edge of the known world. His hands, wrapped in cracked leather, knew the exact tension of the harpoon line. His eyes could read the puff of a blowhole a league away. He was a man of two homes: the green, steep valleys of his birth, and this punishing, fertile sea. The hunt that day had been a success. A right whale, a leviathan of slow-moving bounty, had been taken after a grueling 3-hour chase in the ship's boats. Now the great carcass was lashed alongside the Amalur a black island of blubber. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the richer gagging smell of rendered oil from the try-pots amidships, where fires blazed day and night. The flensing had begun, the dangerous, rhythmic work of stripping the mountain of fat from the flesh. Imal stood on the slippery planks of the cutting stage, a narrow platform slung between ship and whale. In his hand was a flenser, a long, viciously sharp flensing knife. With practised sweeping strokes, he sliced through the thick blanket of blubber, his world reduced to the bite of steel into fat, the heave of the ship, and the shouted coordination of his crewmates. Disaster came not from the whale, but from a moment of misplaced footing and a sudden violent roll of the ship. The man next to Imanol, hauling on a hook embedded in the blubber, lost his balance. His elbow jerked back, knocking Imanol's arm just as he drove the flenser down for a new cut. The blade, deflected from the yielding fat, skittered across a loop of hardened rope, and then, with the full force of his stroke behind it, plunged into the inside of Imanol's own thigh, just above the knee. There was a sickening, solid thunk, more felt than heard. Imanol grunted, a sound of pure surprise. He looked down. The knife's handle protruded from his leg at a grotesque angle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a jet of bright arterial blood, pulsing in time with his thunderous heartbeat, arced out, splattering the greasy deck and the pale blubber. It was not a bleed, it was a fountain, a severed femoral artery. On a ship days from any port, in the 16th century, it was a death sentence written in scarlet. Shouts of alarm cut through the work chants. Hands seized him, dragging him back from the edge of the stage, leaving a slick red trail. The ship's surgeon, a dour Galician named Mateo, whose usual work involved setting bones and lancing boils, took one look and his face paled beneath its weathering. He barked orders. Imanol was carried below to the foul-smelling cockpit, a space reeking of bilge and old pain. The flow of blood was catastrophic, a relentless pump draining the life from him with terrifying speed. Imanol felt the cold seeping in from his extremities, a familiar feeling from icy drenches, but this cold came from within. The clamour of the ship faded, replaced by a ringing in his ears. He saw Mateo's hands, slick and frantic, trying to pack the wound with linen, applying direct pressure that did little to stem the pulsing torrent. He heard the surgeon's muttered oath, a prayer to St. Peter, the patron of fishermen. The darkness at the edges of his vision began to swell, warm and inviting. Matteo, in desperation, resorted to the cautery iron. He shouted for a brazier to be brought, but as the iron heated to a dull glow in the dim hold, something changed. The fierce rhythmic spurting from the wound began to falter. The pool spreading beneath the table slowed its expansion. Matteo, pressing down with all his weight, felt the pressure against his palms diminish from a forceful geyser to a steady, then a trickling flow. He peered, wiping blood from his eyes. The edges of the horrific gash were not just bleeding, they were clumping, drawing together with a viscous, determined cohesion. He had never witnessed in such a severe arterial injury. By the time the cautery iron was ready, the bleeding had nearly stopped on its own, reduced to a slow ooze. Imanol did not die. He hovered in a twilight of shock and loss for 3 days, his body desperately rebuilding the stolen blood. Matteo, astonished, cleaned and stitched the wound, applying poultices of spiderweb and yarrow. He expected fever, gangrene, a slow decline. Neither came. The wound, though grievous, closed cleanly. Within 2 weeks, Imanol was on deck, leaning on a crutch fashioned from a broken oar, his face gaunt but his eyes clear. The crew crossed themselves when he passed. They spoke of a miracle, of the Virgin of Begonia's particular favour for a pious son of the Basque country. Matteo, a man of saws and scalpels, not superstition, had no such explanation. In his log, he wrote a terse, baffled entry: Tamanol harpooner, deep laceration of the upper leg, severing the great vessel, hemorrhage profound, then ceased with unnatural celerity. Recovery robust, contrary to all art and expectation, a constitution of singular fortitude. He could probe no further. The mystery resided in the man's very substance, invisible to the tools of his age. The following spring, Imanol returned to his village, a clutch of whitewashed houses clinging to a hillside in the interior, far from the sea. He walked with a slight limp, a lifelong souvenir of the Terra Nova. He married a local girl, Catalin, and took up the quieter life of a shepherd, tending flocks on the same slopes where he had played as a boy. The story of his survival at sea became part of family lore, a tale told at the hearth on winter nights, growing more dramatic with each telling. The size of the whale, the fury of the sea, the devilish slip, and the heavenly intervention that sealed his wound. It was a story of luck and divine grace. Years folded into decades. Imanol and Catalin had children, and those children had children of their own. The old whaler became a grandfather, his face a map of wrinkles, his hands now gentle on a lamb's back. The great wound was a faded, ropey scar, a private monument. He died peacefully in his bed, at the age of 72, surrounded by family, the salt of the Atlantic long washed from his skin. A generation later, in the same village church of San Juan, a young parish priest named Father Andoni recorded the births and baptisms in a heavy leather-bound ledger. He was a meticulous man, new to the parish, trying to learn the intertwined family trees of his flock. One afternoon, as he updated the registry, he noticed a curious cluster. 2 sisters, the granddaughters of old Imanol, the whaler, had both given birth in the same month. The entries were routine: names, dates, godparents. But in the margin, the midwife, an ancient woman who had assisted at nearly every village birth for 50 years, had made a small, neat notation next to each. For the first sister, she had written postpartum flux, minimal. For the second, bleeding scant, mother vigorous. Father Andoni paused. He remembered the old whaler's story, the miraculous survival. He flipped back through the brittle pages, to the births of these sisters' own mother, and her siblings. There, in the same midwife's hand, were similar notes: quick to mend, or strong blood, asterisk. He traced the line back to Catalin's own birth records, from a different village, and found no such annotations. The pattern seemed to emanate from Imanol's line. It was not dramatic, just a consistent, quiet note of resilience in the dangerous aftermath of childbirth, appearing in his female descendants. The priest leaned back in his hard wooden chair. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high, narrow window, illuminating dust motes above the baptismal font. He was a man of faith, trained to see God's hand in all things. Yet this was not a miracle, not in the explosive, singular sense of Imanol's survival at sea. This was subtler, a gentle persistence of robustness down a family line. He thought of the ancient Basque notions of Odol Garbia, pure blood, a concept tied to lineage and land. Was this a physical manifestation of that old idea, or perhaps a familial blessing, a grace attached to the whaler's providential survival, extending to his progeny? He could not know he was observing the same thread that Joachim in Cordoba had called familial fortitude, the same legacy that had flowed from the steppe through the Phoenician traders. He had no language of genetics, only the language of parish records and observed tradition. In the end, he simply dipped his pen and added a small note of his own at the bottom of the current page, a footnote to the 2 recent births. This vigour of the grandfather Imanol appears to echo in these infants' mothers, a mystery of lineage perhaps. God's ways are woven through families in patterns we but dimly perceive. He closed the ledger, the iron latch clicking shut in the quiet church. Outside, the bells for vespers began to ring, their sound rolling over the green, folded hills. The thread, having survived the icy spray of the Newfoundland coast and a harpooner's blade, now lay quietly encoded in the veins of babies sleeping in cradleboards in the village houses. Its origin was a mystery, its nature undefined. It was simply a part of them, as much a part of their inheritance as the Basque language on their tongues, or the shape of the mountains outside their doors, a silent, enduring whisper from a grandfather who had faced the grey Atlantic, and through a confluence of ancient biology and sheer chance, had lived to pass it on. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 9. The Pioneer's Wife. Part 1. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Appalachian frontier in the late 18th century was a world of teeth, the jagged teeth of mountains biting a hard sky, the sharp teeth of saws and axes biting into virgin timber, and the constant, grinding teeth of hunger and hardship. For Moira Fraser, a Scottish immigrant with peat dark eyes and hands already roughened by a decade of labour, it was a world she had chosen, yet one that seemed determined to test every ounce of her being. She and her husband, Ewan, had claimed a narrow, steep-sided hollow in western Virginia, a patch of stubborn earth wrested from the endless forest. Their home was a single-room cabin of notched logs, its chinks stuffed with mud and moss, its chimney a precarious stack of flat stones. The clearing around it was a battlefield, littered with the stumps of oaks and tulip poplars, their roots still clinging to the rocky soil like the hands of the drowned. Moira's days were a litany of relentless toil. At dawn, she banked the fire and began the day's first fight, coaxing a meagre yield from the thin soil of their garden, potatoes, turnips, a few rows of corn that grew stunted in the mountain shadow. She hauled water from the creek a quarter-mile downslope, the wooden yoke carving grooves into her shoulders. She churned butter, salted meat, spun wool from their 2 scraggly sheep, and mended clothes until her eyes burned in the dim firelight. Ewan was away from dawn till dusk, clearing more land, hunting for meat, or bartering their few surplus goods for nails and salt in the distant settlement. Their isolation was a palpable presence, a silence broken only by the wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk, and the occasional unsettling howl from the deep woods, was upon her in 2 great bounds. She felt a searing, crushing impact on her back, as if a tree had fallen on her. Claws, like iron hooks, tore through her heavy wool coat, her dress, and into the flesh beneath. She was rolled, a rag doll in the jaws of a giant. A swipe of a massive paw caught her side, and she heard more than felt the sickening crack of ribs. Another blow caught her thigh, the claws digging deep. The world dissolved into a white-hot universe of pain, and the overwhelming, musky stink of the animal. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault ceased. The bear, perhaps satisfied she was no longer a threat, or distracted by a sound from the woods, gave a final dismissive huff. It turned and shambled toward the cabin door, sniffing loudly. Moira lay face down in the snow, the warmth of her own blood spreading rapidly, melting a crimson halo around her. The pain was so vast it was almost abstract, a roaring in her ears that drowned out everything else. She saw the bear push against the heavy door, heard the wood groan. Then, from far down the hollow, came the distant, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Ewan returning. The bear hesitated, then with a grunt it turned and lumbered off into the forest, disappearing into the grey shadows of the pines. Silence rushed back in, broken only by Moira's shallow, ragged breaths. She tried to move, to push herself up, but her body would not obey. The world began to tunnel, the edges of her vision darkening. The cold, which had been sharp, now felt like a gentle, inviting blanket. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the cold and the quiet take her. The struggle of the homestead, the relentless hunger, the aching loneliness, it could all just stop. But something deeper, older, and more stubborn than thought stirred within her. It was not courage, not in that moment. It was a biological imperative, a refusal to surrender written in the very code of her cells. The blood soaking into the snow was flowing from multiple deep lacerations and puncture wounds. In another body, such blood loss, combined with the shock and the brutal cold, would have been swiftly fatal. Yet even as her consciousness wavered, the silent, ancient legacy in her veins enacted its quiet protocol. The clotting cascade, subtly more efficient, triggered with a swiftness that belied the severity of the trauma. The torn vessels in her back and thigh began to constrict. Platelets swarmed to the sites with an urgency that was her unspoken inheritance. The hemorrhage, though profound, began to slow its deadly pace. She did not know this. She knew only a dim, dogged spark that refused to be extinguished. With a gasp that tore at her broken ribs, she managed to roll onto her side. Agony, bright and blinding, lanced through her. She focused on the cabin door, 20 feet away. It might as well have been 20 miles. Using her elbows, she began to drag herself forward, an inch at a time, leaving a smeared red trail in the snow. Each movement was a fresh torment, but the alternative was the sweet final sleep. She thought of Ewan finding her body, frozen and empty. She thought of the home they had built with their own hands, left to the wolves and the weather. No, the word formed in her mind, a silent granite-hard syllable. Asterisk. No, asterisk. It took an eternity, a journey measured in heartbeats and searing breaths. She reached the rough-hewn log step, hauled herself up onto it, and used the last of her strength to push the door open. She collapsed just inside, on the packed earth floor, the warmth of the dying fire, a faint caress on her icy skin. Then, darkness took her. Ewan found her there an hour later, a scene of such horrific stillness. His heart stopped in his chest. The cabin was a wreck, the door splintered, their precious food stores scattered where the bear had rummaged after failing to gain full entry, and in the midst of it, Moira, lying in a pool of half-frozen blood, her clothes in tatters, her skin grey. He fell to his knees beside her, a sob wrenching from his throat. He felt for a pulse at her neck, his own fingers numb with cold and dread. There it was, a faint thready flutter, like a trapped bird's wing. What followed was a week of blurred, desperate vigil. Ewan, his own hands shaking, cleaned the wounds as best he could with melted snow and the last of their whiskey. He used a needle and thread meant for mending sacks to clumsily stitch the deepest gashes. He packed the others with a poultice of spiderweb and chewed willow bark, remedies learned from a Shawnee trapper years before. He expected fever, the telltale red streaks of infection, the slow slide into death. He expected to bury his wife in the frozen ground behind the cabin. But Moira, against every law of frontier medicine and common sense, did not die. The fever came, but it burned clean and high, then broke. The wounds, though ugly and swollen, showed no sign of mortification. They began to close, knitting together with a slow, stubborn vitality that astonished Ewan. Her broken ribs were a constant agony, and she was weak as a newborn kitten, surviving on broth he made from the last of their meat. But she lived. Day by painful day, the colour returned to her cheeks, and the fierce light returned to her dark eyes. By the time the first thaw came, softening the snow and revealing the muddy earth beneath, Moira was walking again, leaning heavily on a stick Ewan had carved for her. She was a spectre of her former self, thin and scarred, moving with a permanent, careful stiffness. But she was alive. The story of her survival passed into the lore of the few scattered families in the hollows around them. It was told and retold. Moira Fraser, who faced down a starving bear and lived to tell the tale. They spoke of her incredible toughness, her Scottish stubbornness, the grace of God that had shielded her. It became a legend, a testament to the kind of grit required to tame the wilderness. Moira herself rarely spoke of it. The memory was a dark well of pain and terror she had no wish to revisit. But sometimes, on nights when the wind howled just right, she would touch the raised, ropey scars on her back and thigh. She felt no pride, only a profound, weary wonder. She did not know that the toughness everyone marveled at was rooted in something more than spirit. She did not know that the blood that had soaked the snow had carried within it a silent, ancient signature, a biological heirloom from Ice Age hunters, steppe herders, and isolated mountain folk that had once again tipped the balance in a moment of extreme violence. It had not made her invincible, it had simply made her survivable, and as she stood at the cabin door one spring morning, watching the first green shoots push through the mud, she knew that she would see another season in this hard, beautiful place. The thread, tested in the teeth of the wilderness, had held, and within her, though she was unaware, it pulsed on, ready for the next generation, and the next quiet chapter of its endless hidden journey. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 9, The Pioneer's Wife, Part 2, asterisk, asterisk. The scars on Moira's back and thigh never faded, remaining as pale, ropey testaments to the winter of the bear. They ached in the damp, a private barometer for the storms that rolled through the Appalachian hollows. But they did not stop her. Within 2 years she was again hauling water, tending the expanded garden, and spinning wool, her movements perhaps a shade more deliberate, but her strength undiminished. The legend of her survival had woven itself into the fabric of the frontier, a story of grit that neighbors told to bolster their own courage during hard times. For Moira and Ewan, it was simply the past, a dark chapter in the ongoing story of making a life from the stubborn mountain earth. Their daughter Eleanor grew up in the shadow of that story, but also in the light of her mother's quiet perseverance. Born 3 years after the attack, she was a child of the frontier, with her mother's dark, watchful eyes and her father's sturdy build. Her world was the steep, wooded slopes, the chattering creek, the small, hard-won clearing. She learned to shoot a squirrel with a .22 rifle at 10, to identify edible mushrooms and poisonous snakes, to churn butter and render lard. The tale of her mother and the bear was as much a part of her upbringing as the Bible or the changing seasons, a lesson in the precariousness and tenacity of life on the edge of the wilderness. When Eleanor turned 18, a new path opened, one that would carry the family's story beyond the isolated hollow. At a seasonal gathering for a barn raising in the next valley over, she met Daniel Carter. He was not from the tight-knit Scotch-Irish community of the High Hollows, but from a lower settlement, a family of English descent who had come west from the Tidewater region. He was a blacksmith by trade, with strong, burn-scarred forearms and a calm, steady demeanour that contrasted with the often volatile temperament of the mountain men. He spoke of a different world, of towns with more than one street, of churches with proper steeples, of the great rivers to the west that led to lands beyond imagining. Their courtship was a quiet rebellion. Moira, remembering her own journey from a Scottish glen to this wilderness, understood the pull of the wider world, but she feared the dilution of the hard-won community they had built. Ewan was more pragmatic. A blacksmith was a valuable connection, a bringer of tools and repair. When Daniel asked for Eleanor's hand, it was granted, with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The wedding was a simple affair in the Fraser cabin, after which Daniel took his bride back to his own small homestead and smithy, a day's ride down the valley, where the hills began to soften into rolling foothills. Eleanor's new life was a blending of lineages and traditions. She brought her mother's mountain remedies and resilience into a household that followed more anglicized customs. Daniel's family, while wary of the wild, hollow folk at first, came to respect Eleanor's competence and quiet strength. The trait she carried, the silent legacy in her blood, was now mingled with Daniel's different genetic history, a dilution in the statistical sense, but not an erasure. It persisted, a single recessive thread woven into a new, more complex pattern. Her pregnancy the following year was uneventful, marked by the usual fatigue and the steady swelling of life. Daniel fussed over her, insisting she rest more, but Eleanor, schooled by Moira's example, worked until the day her labour began. It started at midnight, with a deep, cramping ache that announced itself with unmistakable clarity. A spring storm had been building all evening, and as Eleanor's pains quickened, it broke over the valley with theatrical fury. Thunder cannonaded across the hills, shaking the small log house. Lightning flashed, bleaching the room an electric blue for an instant, revealing the frantic concern on Daniel's face. Rain lashed the roof like a torrent of pebbles, and the wind howled around the eaves, a wild chorus to her own gathering struggle. Daniel, his mind racing, knew the plan. He was to saddle the horse and ride for his mother, who lived 2 miles away and had midwifed all her own children. He pulled on his boots and coat, shouting over the storm that he would be back with help. Eleanor, kneeling by the bed, gripped the post and nodded, her jaw set. But as he flung the door open, a blinding fork of lightning struck a tall pine across the creek with a crack like the world splitting. The tree, sheared in half, crashed down across the narrow track that was their only road, its trunk and a tangled web of branches forming an impassable barricade. Daniel stood in the doorway, the driving rain soaking him instantly, staring at the wreckage. The horse would never get through in the dark and the mud. He was trapped. She was alone. He turned back, his face ashen. Eleanor read the truth in his eyes. There would be no midwife, no mother-in-law with her reassuring hands and herbal teas. There was only this room, the fire, the storm, and the relentless mounting pressure within her. A cold fear, colder than the rain, touched her heart. She had assisted at a lambing once, had heard the women's stories, but she was not a midwife. The stories she remembered most vividly were the bad ones, the mothers who bled out, the babies who came wrong. Yet as another contraction seized her, a different memory surfaced, clear and calm, her mother's voice, telling not of the bear, but of ordinary things, of how to stanch a deep cut with moss and pressure, of how the body knew what to do, if you could just stay out of its way. Moira had survived not by magic, but by a fundamental stubborn will to live that was itself a kind of instruction. Eleanor clung to that. She was her mother's daughter. She would have to be. Between contractions, she directed Daniel, boil water, tear clean linen, build up the fire. Her voice was strained but steady, a thread of order in the chaotic night. Daniel, grateful for commands, obeyed with a frantic efficiency. The labour progressed with a swift, intense force. Eleanor moved from the bed to a blanket she had spread before the hearth, seeking the fire's warmth and a solid floor beneath her. The world narrowed to the circle of firelight, the roar of the storm, and the primal rhythm taking over her body. Time lost meaning. There was only the wave of pain, the ebb, and the gathering again. When the final tearing urge came, she braced herself against the heavy oak table Daniel had dragged close. He knelt behind her, his hands ready but trembling, guided by her terse, gasped instructions. And then, with a final guttural cry that was lost in a peal of thunder, the child was born into Daniel's waiting hands, a son, slick and blue for a heart-stopping moment, before he drew his first breath and announced his arrival with a furious, healthy wail that defied the storm's cacophony. Eleanor collapsed forward, spent as Daniel, weeping with relief and awe, tended to the infant, clearing his mouth, wiping him with a warm cloth. The immediate danger, however, had not passed. As the afterbirth was delivered, Eleanor felt the warm, ominous gush she had feared. In the firelight she saw Daniel's eyes widen in fresh horror at the blood. He reached for the linen compresses, but the hemorrhage, though significant, lacked the catastrophic pulsing force of a true arterial breach. The tears from the birth, while substantial, began to clot with a swiftness that belied the trauma. Eleanor, floating in a haze of exhaustion, felt the flow lessen from a rush to a seep. It was her mother's legacy, operating silently within her, the same biological quirk that had stanched Moira's ravaged back in the snow, now worked to contract her daughter's womb and seal the vascular breaches with efficient microscopic haste. It was not a miracle of absence, but of moderation, a crucial life-saving difference. By the time the storm blew itself out near dawn, leaving a world washed clean and sparkling under a pale pink sky, the crisis had passed. Eleanor lay clean and bundled in bed, the infant named Thomas, for Daniel's father, sleeping in the crook of her arm. She was weak, her body feeling hollowed out and bruised, but the dangerous bleeding had stopped. Daniel, slumped in a chair beside her, looked as though he had aged 10 years. He had witnessed a raw elemental power in his wife that filled him with a reverence beyond words. He attributed it to her mountain stock, to the legendary Fraser toughness made manifest. Eleanor, drifting into a grateful sleep, thought only of her mother. She had done it alone, as Moira had been alone in the snow. The thread, she felt in her bones, had held again. It was in her, and now, as she looked at Thomas's perfect sleeping face, she knew it was in him too. A diluted strain, perhaps, mixed with Daniel's English blood, but present, a silent passenger. Thomas Carter would grow up not in the high, isolated hollow, but in the foothills, where the roads were better and the horizons wider. He would hear the story of his birth during the great storm, of his mother's fierce courage. He would also hear, less often, the older story of his grandmother and the bear. They would be tales of family character, of frontier fortitude. He would carry them west with him, when, as a young man, he joined the swelling tide of expansion, drawn by stories of richer land beyond the Mississippi. He would take a wife on the Oregon Trail, a woman of mixed German and Welsh descent, and they would face their own trials under vast prairie skies. And within him, undetectable and unremarked, the ancient, quiet anomaly would travel too, a biological whisper from glacial Europe, carried through millennia, across oceans into mountains, and now poised on the edge of the great American West. Its power was not in dominance, but in simple, tenacious presence, a thread of resilience woven so finely into the tapestry of humanity that it was invisible until the moment, generation after generation, when the storm came, and it quietly, steadfastly held. Asterisk. Chapter 10. The Hidden Records. Asterisk. Vienna in the autumn of 1913 was a city of elegant decay, a grand opera entering its final poignant act. The air along the Ringstrasse carried the scent of roasting chestnuts and coal smoke, of perfume and impending ruin. In a cramped, book-lined office at the university, overlooking a courtyard where yellow leaves skittered across the cobbles, Dr. Felix Landauer worked with the quiet desperation of a man trying to solve a puzzle before the lights went out. His field was hereditary pathology, a nascent science obsessed with tracing the ghosts of disease through family trees. His world was one of pedigrees and probabilities, of seeking the faint statistical whispers of inheritance in a cacophony of human suffering. Landauer was a meticulous man, slight of build, with eyes that seemed permanently strained from peering at fine print. His own history was a tapestry of Mitteleuropa, a secular Jew from Prague, educated in Berlin, now clinging to a minor research post in the Habsburg capital. He believed in order, in patterns, in the rational mapping of biological fate. The gathering political storms, the nationalist fervour sharpening the air, felt to him like a regression into tribal chaos, antithetical to the clear universal language of science he sought to speak. His current project was a study of infant mortality in isolated alpine communities. The prevailing wisdom held that such inbred populations were genetic dead ends, reservoirs of deleterious traits and congenital defects. Landauer sought to quantify this, to provide statistical heft to the assumption. He had spent months travelling by train and mail coach to remote villages in the Tyrol and Salzburg regions, gaining access to parish records that had often been kept in the same spidery hand for centuries. In cold stone churches, he had sat with patient priests, turning pages of vellum and later cheap pulp paper, transcribing columns of births, marriages and deaths. He sought clusters of hereditary ailments, deafness, dwarfism, the peculiar Habsburg jaw. He expected to find a grim confirmation of genetic decay, but as he compiled his data back in Vienna, cross-referencing family names across generations, a different, subtler pattern began to emerge, one that refused to fit the narrative of degeneration. In 3 particular villages, nestled in high valleys that saw snow well into May, he found lineages, often with distinctive recurring surnames like *Ager, Huber, and Schwartz, that showed a curious statistical anomaly. Across 4, sometimes 5 generations, the infant mortality rate within these families was noticeably, consistently lower than the village average. Not dramatically so, but by a margin of 10 to 15%. It was not that their children never died. They succumbed to accidents, to the same waves of diphtheria or measles that swept through the valleys. But the quiet, mysterious killers of infancy, the sudden fevers, the unexplained failures to thrive, the hemorrhagic complications following birth that filled the parish registers with tiny, sorrowful entries, seemed to visit these households less frequently. Landauer at first suspected better nutrition, cleaner water, or more attentive care, but his data argued against it. These were not the wealthier families. They were shepherds and smallholders like their neighbours. The villages were small, their resources shared. The pattern was too specific to certain intermarried clans, too persistent across time to be environmental. It followed the bloodline. Late one night, the electric lamp on his desk casting a pool of light on his charts. Landauer leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The numbers whispered of a protective factor, something inherited that conferred a slight but significant resilience in the perilous first year of life. His mind, trained in Mendelian genetics, raced through possibilities. Could it be a resistance to a common bacterial strain, endemic to the region, a more robust immune response, or perhaps something related to blood compatibility between mother and infant, a field still in its utter infancy? He had read of the work on blood groups by Landsteiner, but the complexities of rhesus factors were unknown, a discovery decades in the future. He thought of the families themselves. In one village, an old midwife had told him, when he asked about the Hubers, they are tough stock, good blood, the mothers recover quickly. It was folk wisdom, the same kind of vague attribution he had encountered in the old Basque priest's notes and the Moorish physician's scrolls, had he but known it. To Landauer, it was a clue, not an explanation. He began to draft a paper, his pen scratching in the silent office. He titled it provisionally, Beobachtungen zu einer hereditären Reduktion der Säuglingssterblichkeit in isolierten alpinen Populationen. Observations on a hereditary reduction in infant mortality in isolated alpine populations. The paper was dry, cautious, laden with tables and statistical analysis. He avoided grandiose claims, presenting it merely as a curious epidemiological anomaly worthy of further study. He suggested the possibility of an unidentified hereditary factor that might offer a selective advantage in harsh closed environments. It was a whisper of an idea, a faint crack in the prevailing dogma of inbred deterioration. He submitted it to a minor Swiss journal of heredity and social medicine, a publication read by a few dozen specialists across Europe. It was published in the spring of 1914, a slim article buried between a study on twin inheritance and a treatise on eugenic policy. A few colleagues wrote letters, some intrigued, most skeptical, attributing his findings to statistical noise or unaccounted environmental variables. Landauer filed the correspondence away, planning further research. He wanted to obtain blood samples, a fantastically difficult prospect, to see if any serological peculiarities correlated with his families. He dreamed of a research trip to the Basque Country, having read vague anthropological references to unusual blood patterns there, wondering if it was a related phenomenon. History had other plans. In the summer of 1914, the Archduke was shot in Sarajevo. The world Landauer knew, the world of international correspondence and slow, careful scholarship, evaporated overnight. He was not drafted. His myopia and slight frame deemed him unfit, but the university emptied, funds dried up, and the intellectual atmosphere curdled into nationalism and suspicion. His work, with its focus on obscure alpine villages, seemed irrelevant, a peacetime luxury. The war ground on. In 1916, struggling to maintain his position, Landauer was assigned to a military hospital, tasked with compiling statistics on wound recovery and infection rates. His alpine study, his charts and parish transcripts were boxed and stored in a basement archive. He thought of them sometimes, a ghost of a mystery unsolved, as he tabulated the endless grim numbers of young men shattered by machine guns and artillery. In 1918, with the empire collapsing and Vienna starving, a flu pandemic swept through the city. It filled the hospitals, then the morgues. Landauer, working amidst the chaos, fell ill himself. The fever was a furnace, the cough racking. In his delirium, his mind returned to the high valleys, to the clean, cold air, to the names in the ledgers: Egger, Huber, Schwartz, **. He thought of their quiet statistical advantage, their slight hedge against death. It seemed a cruel joke. Here, in the heart of modern civilization, people were dying in heaps, and his delicate, inherited resilience, if it even existed, was powerless against this viral storm. He recovered, but his health was broken, a persistent weakness in his lungs. The post-war years were a struggle for survival in a shrunken, impoverished Austria. Landauer's position was tenuous. The new intellectual currents were hostile to his kind of painstaking apolitical scholarship. In 1922, facing dismissal and rising anti-Semitism, he made the difficult decision to emigrate, accepting a lowly research fellowship at a university in Manchester. He could take little with him: his personal books, some clothes, the heavy boxes of his research notes, including the only copies of his parish transcripts and the data for his 1914 paper, were left behind with a colleague, a gentle botanist named Professor Zweig, who promised to store them safely. Landauer rebuilt a quiet life in England, but his health never fully returned. He died of pneumonia in 1931, largely forgotten, his Alpine study never revisited. A decade later, in the cataclysm of another war, Vienna was bombed. The university archive, where Professor Zweig had stored Landauer's boxes, took a direct hit. The papers, the carefully transcribed records of births and deaths from 100 Alpine villages, the charts with their faint promising pattern, were incinerated, lost to ash and oblivion. If you marry a woman who is Rh positive, which most are, and you have a baby, there usually isn't a problem with the first one. But during that birth, some of the baby's positive blood can get into the mother's bloodstream. Her body might see it as foreign and make antibodies against it. Then, if she has another baby that's also Rh positive, those antibodies can cross the placenta and attack that baby's blood cells. It can be very serious. She saw the concern flash in his eyes and patted his arm. Now don't you worry. They have shots for that now, treatments. Medicine is getting wise to it. But it's good to know, knowledge is power. She handed him a cookie from a plate and a small paper cup of orange juice. Rest here a few minutes, drink that, and welcome to a rather exclusive club. John sat back, the sweet, crumbly cookie tasteless in his mouth. The gym buzzed around him, the murmur of other donors, the clink of equipment, the squeak of a janitor's mop near the doors, but he was suddenly elsewhere. The words Rh negative echoed in his mind, a clinical label for something he had carried unknowingly for 22 years. It felt like being told he had a secret birthmark on his soul. His thoughts travelled, as they often did when he was thoughtful, to his grandmother, Nana Miller, born Elizabeth Ibarra, a small, fierce woman with a heavy accent that softened only when she sang old songs in a language John never understood. She was Basque, she'd told him, from a place of mountains and shepherds, a people apart. She had stories, fragments really, of a homeland so old it was a mystery even to itself, of a language unlike any other in Europe, of a toughness born from isolation. Our blood is strong, *mutila, *, she would say, using the Basque word for boy, her gnarled hand squeezing his. It remembers the high places. At the time, he'd thought it was just an old woman's pride, a romantic notion from the old country. Now, in the fluorescent glare of the gym, with the nurse's words about rarity and inheritance hanging in the air, the stories took on a new, startling dimension. Could it be? Was this strange, named thing in his blood, this Rh negative that required medical explanation and future planning, the same strong blood Nana spoke of? Was her folk wisdom a shadowy, intuitive recognition of a biological fact? He finished his juice, the tartness bringing him back to the present. He stood, a little light-headed, and thanked Nurse Caldwell. She gave him a booklet about blood types and a donor card with own age stamped prominently on it. He walked out of the gym into the crisp autumn sunlight, the paper bag with his belongings feeling different in his hand. He was John Miller, American, ex-GI, now a machinist at the local plant. But he was also, according to science, a statistical anomaly, and according to the ghost of his grandmother, a bearer of an ancient resilient line. For the first time in its long, silent journey, the trait had been named, categorized, and its modern implications explained. It was no longer just a whispered family legend or a healer's unexplained observation. It was a datum on a medical chart, a factor in family planning, a note in a Red Cross ledger. Yet, for all that naming, its true story remained utterly untold. The nurse knew its asterisk what asterisk, and its asterisk why asterisk for pregnancy. But the how? The epic millennia-long trek from glacial refuges to Pyrenean valleys, from Phoenician ships to Basque whalers, from Appalachian hollows to this Midwestern town, was a history written in a language science was only beginning to decipher. John carried that history, a living archive, but he could not read it. He felt its weight, though, as he drove home past rows of tidy modern houses. He was a link between a deep, shrouded past and a clinically mapped present, between Nana's stories of mountain strength and the nurse's talk of antibodies and shots. The hidden thread had surfaced, just for a moment, into the light of day, given a name but not a narrative. It pulsed on, a quiet mystery in his veins, recognized yet still profoundly unknown, a biological whisper from the age of ice, now sitting behind the wheel of a '55 Chevrolet, heading home for Saturday lunch. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 12, The Global Thread, asterisk, asterisk. The digital map on Ilara Vance's screen was a tapestry of light against a field of black. It was not a map of nations or borders, but of human movement, a visualization of deep history written in the silent language of alleles. Each pinprick of light represented a confirmed instance of the Rh-negative trait in her growing dataset, a constellation of quiet anomalies scattered across the globe. She leaned forward in her office chair, the hum of the university building, a distant drone. Her work had moved from the intimate quiet of the lab to this vast digital reconstruction. She was no longer just a geneticist reading her own blood. She was a cartographer of a hidden diaspora. The story began, as her model suggested, with a faint sparse cluster of lights in southwestern Europe during the last glacial maximum, a refuge where small bands of humans had clung to survival. From that icy bottleneck, the lights began a slow, tentative drift. A thicker knot formed in the Pyrenees, the Basque Country glowing with a persistent, concentrated brightness that spoke of millennia of isolation. This was the heartland, the reservoir. Then, like spores caught on a wind, the points began to stream outward along the ancient highways of humanity. She watched the animation play. Flickers travelled east with early farmers from Anatolia. A trickle moved south across the Mediterranean with Phoenician traders, leaving faint dots along the North African coast, and on islands like Sardinia and Sicily. A more defined stream followed the Celtic expansions into the British Isles and Western Europe, those lights burning in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Another pulse moved with the Germanic migrations, scattering points across Central Europe. The Basque whalers of the 16th century appeared as a sudden daring leap across the Atlantic, a spark jumping to the Newfoundland coast, then fading, not extinct, but diluted into the vastness of the New World. But it was the modern era that transformed the map from a story of slow diffusion to one of global entanglement. The 19th and 20th centuries exploded with movement. Lights flared in ports like Buenos Aires and New York, carried by waves of European immigrants. They appeared in the Appalachian hollows, then followed the wagon trails west across North America. They dotted the landscapes of Australia and New Zealand. The trait, once a marker of profound isolation, had become a passenger on the ships, trains, and later airplanes of a shrinking world. Its dispersal was no longer a genetic drift, but a reflection of every war, famine, economic hope, and colonial ambition that had reshaped the human population. Ilara's research had moved beyond published datasets. She had begun reaching out, a digital archaeologist seeking living carriers. Her request, posted on genealogy forums and through rare blood-type registries, was simple. She sought stories, family histories, any fragment of oral tradition that might accompany the biological fact. The responses trickled in, a quiet chorus from around the world. One in particular had compelled her to book a flight, and so days later she found herself sitting in a sun-drenched apartment in Kyoto, Japan, across from a woman named Aiko Tanaka. Aiko was in her 70s, elegant and poised, her hands resting calmly on a low tea table. She had responded to Elara's inquiry after a grandson's routine blood test revealed the anomaly, a puzzling result in a country where the trait was vanishingly rare, found in less than 0.5% of the population. It was a curiosity, of course, Aiko said through a translator, her voice soft but precise. The doctor was quite surprised. He asked many questions about foreign ancestry. She paused, sipping her green tea. My mother was Hafu, half. Her father was an American soldier. He was stationed in Okinawa after the war. He married my grandmother, a local woman. He was from a place called Pennsylvania, I believe, a coal mining region. He had dark red hair, and my mother said, a very serious disposition. He died when my mother was young, in an accident. We knew little else. Elara listened, her recorder capturing the gentle cadence of the translated words. Here was the global thread made personal, a single filament stretching from post-war Okinawa to the Appalachian foothills of Pennsylvania. Aiko's American grandfather, perhaps a descendant of Scotch-Irish settlers, themselves carriers of a lineage that stretched back to the British Isles, and ultimately to those European refugia, had through the chaotic intimacy of war and occupation planted this genetic whisper in utterly foreign soil. In Aiko, and in her children and grandson, it persisted, a biological footnote to a historical moment, utterly disconnected from its deep history yet physically present. Do you feel any different? Elara asked gently. Because of this in your blood? Aiko considered the question, a faint smile touching her lips. Different? No, I am Japanese. This is just a medical detail, a surprise. But, she added, her gaze turning inward, my mother was very strong. She raised me alone after her own mother passed. She worked very hard in difficult times. People always remarked on her resilience. They said she had a strong spirit. She met Elara's eyes. Perhaps it was in her blood. Elara felt a familiar, profound resonance. The same attribution. Strength, fortitude, a strong spirit echoing across centuries and cultures from Hakem in Cordoba to the Basque priest to the Appalachian neighbours of Moira Fraser. It was the universal human explanation for the inexplicable, a way to give meaning to the silent workings of biology. Back in her office, Elara integrated Aiko's story into her map. She added a new point over Kyoto, connected by a thin dashed line to a point in Pennsylvania. The model was not just statistical anymore, it was becoming narrative. Each point now had a potential story, a soldier, a trader, a migrant, a pioneer, a person whose life choices, often made in ignorance of this cellular passenger, had become vectors for its dispersal. She zoomed out. The globe was now speckled with these points of light. They were densest in Western Europe, particularly in the Basque region. They thinned out across Eastern Europe and Asia, became rare in Africa, and were almost absent in indigenous populations of the Americas and East Asia, except where recent migration had introduced them. In places like Japan or Korea, a lone light like Aiko's was a stark indicator of very recent genetic admixture, a timestamp of the 20th century. The trait's persistence was the true mystery. It offered no modern advantage. In fact, as Nurse Caldwell had explained to John Miller, it could complicate reproduction without medical intervention. Yet here it was, in every corner of the globe. Its survival, Elara mused, was a testament not to its power, but to its neutrality in most circumstances, and to the sheer relentless mixing and moving of humanity. It had hitched a ride on the great migrations, surviving bottlenecks not because it was essential, but because it was not harmful enough to be weeded out. And in the deep past, in those moments of crisis, she had spent the year imagining the gashes, the fevers, the hemorrhages. It might have provided that crucial marginal advantage, that slight tilt of the balance toward life that allowed the thread to continue. She saved the visualization, the globe rotating slowly on her screen, a silent symphony of dispersal and endurance. The project had become more than a genetic inquiry. It was a meditation on connection, The Basque whaler and the Kyoto grandmother were linked by an invisible biological thread. The Phoenician merchant and the Appalachian pioneer shared a common cellular heirloom. The story was not one of a superior bloodline, but of a shared hidden history written in a minority of veins across the world. It was a story of chance, survival, and the endless weaving journey of human beings across the planet, carrying within them not just their cultures and languages, but these quiet, ancient signatures of a deep and common past. The global thread was, ultimately, a thread of shared humanity, a reminder that beneath the staggering diversity of human experience lay these intimate biological connections, whispering of journeys taken long before the drawing of maps or the writing of histories. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 13. The Silent Inheritance. Asterisk. Asterisk. The afternoon light in her sister's living room was the colour of warm honey, slanting through the bay window to pool on the rug where a toy rabbit lay forgotten. Elara Vance sat on the overstuffed sofa, the weight of centuries feeling both immense and feather-light in her arms. Her niece Chloe, just 8 months old, slept against her shoulder, a compact bundle of warmth and milky scent. The baby's breath came in soft, even puffs against Elara's neck, each exhalation a tiny, trusting surrender. In her hand, Elara held a simple printout, the results from the newborn screening panel. Her sister had requested more out of thoroughness than concern. One line was highlighted, Rh-D antigen, negative. The discovery had been a quiet family moment a week prior. Her sister's slightly puzzled phone call. The doctor said it's rare, but nothing to worry about. Just something to note for later. Like yours, right? Elara had confirmed it, her voice calm, while her mind had instantly woven this new tiny point into the vast invisible tapestry she had spent the last year mapping. Now, holding the child, the abstraction of data dissolved into the profound reality of skin and breath. She looked down at the sleeping face. Chloe's features were still soft with infancy, but Elara could see the family in her, her sister's determined chin, her own father's wide brow, and within her, flowing in a silent river no wider than a human hair, was a biological heirloom of unimaginable antiquity. Elara's year of research, of tracing flickers on maps and imagining lives in the shadows of history, converged in this peaceful room. The chain was unbroken, and it culminated here, in this ordinary, miraculous child. Her mind did not see genes or alleles, it saw people. She saw Anak on the frozen tundra, his spear arm strong, his blood singing with the same quiet difference that now flowed in Chloe. She saw Kira, holding her own infant daughter Lena in a steaming valley, the fever broken, the thread secured for another generation. The images unfolded like pages in a book only she could read. Sana on the endless steppe, surviving the flood of birth. Bren touching the great Sarsen stone, his old blood having weathered a plague. Livia, pale and sensitive, descending from her mountain refuge with Ineko's blue glass bead at her throat, carrying the legacy into the mixing world. The chain stretched, link by silent link. Damas the Phoenician, scanning a twilight sea, his blood a hidden cargo in his merchant ship. Hakim in the sun-drenched library of Cordoba, penning his note on familial fortitude with scholarly care, oblivious to the cellular truth. Imanal the Basque whaler, the cautery iron cooling unused as his lifeblood stubbornly clotted on the deck of the Asterisk. Amala le Asterisk. Moira Fraser, dragging herself through crimson snow toward a cabin door, her will to live fused with an ancient biological tenacity. Her daughter Eleanor, bringing a son named Thomas into the world by firelight as a storm raged, the thread holding fast. Dr. Landauer, in his Vienna office, his charts hinting at a mystery soon to be lost to fire. John Miller in the high school gym, hearing the words Rh negative and thinking of his Basque grandmother's stories. And then the great global scattering, the thread-leaping oceans with immigrants and soldiers, appearing as a medical surprise in a Kyoto apartment, a silent witness to love and war and the relentless blending of the world. All of it, every struggle, every survival, every quiet moment of persistence across 45,000 years had led to this, a sleeping child in a sunlit room in the 21st century. Chloe stirred, a small fist curling against Elara's collarbone. Elara adjusted her hold, feeling the solid warm weight, The hidden power, she understood now with a clarity that was almost physical, was not dominance. It was not about conferring greatness or ensuring victory. It was about quiet endurance. It was about a slight cellular advantage that whispered rather than shouted, a biological echo of deep human history that had simply persisted. It had flowed through herders and builders, sailors and scholars, pioneers and patients, not because it was essential, but because it was enough. It was enough to tip the balance in 1,000 unrecorded crises, to allow a mother to live, a child to thrive, a lineage to continue. Its purpose was not to shape empires, but to sustain lives. Its story was the story of humanity itself, not the grand narratives of kings and conquests, but the intimate universal saga of survival and inheritance. The awe she felt was gentle, humbling. It held no triumph, only a deep reverence for the chain of being. She was a part of it, and so was this child. The research, the maps, the stories, they were all just an attempt to listen to a whisper that had been passed down through the ages. The true evidence was here, breathing softly in her arms. The silent inheritance was not a burden or a secret. It was a connection, a living thread to every ancestor who had carried it, a biological memory of ice ages and steppes, of stone circles and sailing ships, of mountain valleys and frontier hollows. Chloe's eyes fluttered open, deep blue and unfocused with sleep. She gazed up at her aunt, a tiny, wordless recognition. Alara smiled, a tear she hadn't felt coming, tracing a warm path down her cheek. She did not see a rare blood type. She saw a miracle of continuity. The thread, having traversed continents and millennia, was now present in this new perfect life. It would shape Chloe's medical history, a footnote on future charts, but its greater meaning was far more profound. It was a testament to resilience, a whisper of an ancient world still present, quite literally, in our veins. It was the quiet, enduring pulse of deep time, beating in the heart of a child, promising nothing but its own stubborn, beautiful persistence. The story had no end. It simply continued, silent and sacred, in the soft rhythm of a sleeping baby's breath.